how did the language begin? Well, a common definition of language goes something like this. A common definition of written language. The norm of writing is phonemic, to symbolize all the sounds of a language and none other. And that's sort of a typical definition. But is it really the norm? If we look around the world and say, where was writing invented? Well, we have Mesopotamia, cuneiform, Egypt, which is hieroglyphic, Mayan civilization, much later, which was hieroglyphic, and China, which was also hieroglyphic. So originally, writing did not represent sounds, in the case of hieroglyphics. Writing represented things. It was a way of representing the world. Chinese today is the only survivor of all those early hieroglyphic languages. Writing came to symbolize sounds in only one place, in Mediterranean civilization. The way it happened apparently was this, that Egyptian hieroglyphs became alphabetic when they began to, so to speak, take a big picture of a bear and use it to represent the sound of B. Right? From Egyptian, we get Hebrew, Arabic, Devanagari, and Phoenician. And from Phoenician, we get Greek and Roman. China does not alphabetize. Why does this matter? Now, I think it matters because, as you'll be seeing later, very early on, there's the idea that there should be one king over all the peoples of the world. And in some ways, this notion of a hieroglyphic writing made that true. One writing system could be shared by everybody, precisely because it wasn't entirely based on spoken language. Now, it's going to be more complicated than that, as I'll show you in a moment. It was also the case, historically, that this writing system could be shared by people who spoke different languages, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. And Korean and Japanese were grammatically different. But the Chinese writing system could be adopted. Bill Kirby's already mentioned that under the influence of Western nationalism, there was a desire to make writing the equal of language and have everyone share the same writing, teach everyone writing, but that to do that they realized they'd also have to teach everybody the same language, the same spoken language. And that has never proved entirely possible for the majority of the population. And in fact, in Taiwan, there have been voices, pro-independence voices, that have argued that it would be a very good idea to get rid of Chinese altogether and use the Roman alphabet to symbolize spoken Taiwanese, precisely in order to cut the bonds to China, to cut the bonds that the written language gives. Now, let me say something about, with illustrations now, about the logic of the Chinese writing system. And you'll see at this point that it actually is more complicated than being a hieroglyphic. Take, for example, the notion of a tree, here on your left in the earliest form and on the right in the modern form, or the sun. Both of these are arguably representations of things. But how would you say the East? How could you represent a concept like the East? Well, in fact, you don't. You take two different characters and you put them together. In this case, the sun rising through trees, dong, and now you've created the word for the East. How about to see, the act of seeing with your eyes? Well, the solution to that was to have a picture of the eye, a hieroglyphic, with on top of legs, right? So an eye on legs was to represent to seeing. Now, Chinese is marked by a very, very large number of homophones. That is, things that sound the same, are pronounced the same. There are only about 400 distinct sounds in modern Chinese, in modern Mandarin. And it seems that this must have been true, or something similar to this must have been true when Chinese writing first appeared. Because we see that people have already, in the very first writings we have, in the very first texts, that they use characters for their sound value to represent a word that has the same sound value. And let me give you an example. On the left, you see the early graph, a hieroglyph for an elephant. You can see the elephant's ear there well enough. And on the right, you see at the top that same word in modern writing, pronounced xiang, which is used to mean elephant and to mean ivory. Below that, you see that same word, that same character, with the addition of an element on the left called the man radical, which means portrait, which is also pronounced xiang. In other words, xiang, elephant, xiang, portrait, are homophones. And so they use the character that was originally used to represent elephant also to represent this particular homophone. Let me give you a more complicated example. On the left, you see the ancient graph for a fur pelt. Contemporary version of this would be on the right, top right, pronounced cho. It means, in modern Chinese, it means to seek, no particular relationship to a fur pelt. But the sound value, cho, if you add on combine that with another symbol on another graph, jade in this case, cho, you have a jade ball. If you put the character for clothing underneath it, you have a fur robe. That does have a connection to a fur pelt. And if you put the character for insect to the left of it to make a new character, also pronounced cho, you get the name of an insect. And all these developments have already taken place when writing appears in 1200 BC. We simply do not know how Chinese writing evolved. It is possible that it was invented on the spot and put together, right? There are other cases where written languages get invented in a very short period of time. In any case, we have no history of its evolution at all. And this is the writing that spread eventually to China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. But interestingly, not to the tribal peoples of the West and the North, who made a point of making sure that their written languages, which they had to invent much later and sort of invented on demand, that their written languages would be distinct from Chinese in order to maintain their own separate identity. And you see this here in images of the Khitan and the Jurchen script, which comes from the 11th and 12th century AD. So a common writing goes with a common culture, becomes something that provides continuity over time, shareable by many peoples speaking many languages. And that's why I think that, in fact, writing is of fundamental importance to Chinese identity and has been ever since it was first invented.